Well, let's now speak to David Des Roches about all this. He's former NATO Operations Director in the Office of U.S. Secretary of Defense. He joins us from Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for being with us. So $43 billion in support for Ukraine from NATO announced at the summit in Washington, including F-16 fighter jets, new strategic air defense systems. Will this, you think, help Ukraine turn the tide in the war against Russia?
I think it will, particularly the air defense and the offensive air assets. So this last summer has been Russia's best chance to finally overrun and conquer all of Ukraine. They had a significant material advantage, particularly from air-launched glide bombs, which would take off from Russian bases in pre-2014 Russian territory, launch these air-glided bombs over Russian terrain, and they would land, most of them, in Ukraine. There was no effective counter for that. Some of them would land in Russia. By getting an effective airborne capability, Ukraine will be able to interdict these launching platforms before they can actually do that, push the Russians further back. Then at the same time, the hope is that this equipment will hit Ukraine as the Russians reach strategic exhaustion, particularly with an inability to replace their artillery tubes. So I think what we're seeing is the culminating point of the Russian offensive, and then a shift to a Ukrainian tactical advantage along the battlefield, in large part because of this material.
But David, how fine a line is NATO walking here with this support for Ukraine? They've also pledged an irreversible commitment to Ukraine's membership. Will Europe and the U.S. be safer with Ukraine in NATO? I mean, how much longer can NATO avoid direct confrontation with Russia?
That's a very good question. The issue, it is an extremely fine line, because on the one hand, you cannot have a NATO member that is in a direct conflict, a newly accessioned NATO member, because then NATO members would be obligated to go to power. You want to show support for Ukraine, and you want to provide support for Ukraine. And you also don't want to feed into the Russian propaganda narrative that, its imperial war of conquest was there to counter NATO. I mean, Russia's own actions have created the NATO involvement. NATO was pretty much asleep until they did this. So it's a very, very fine line. And, as you've seen, some of the actions need to be taken, like allowing Western-provided weapons to strike military targets in pre-2014 Russian soil. It's always been okay for the Ukrainians to attack Russian targets in Crimea, which is Ukraine, contrary to what the guy said in the previous segment. But, that's a tough thing. And so NATO has to support Ukraine, provide them real capability, but not provide evidence for the Russian narrative that it's engaged in a war in NATO and not a colonial war of conquest. Those are tough. Those are tough things to do, and I think that doing it properly will result in a lot of people being unhappy with the outcome. But by and large, I think we'll get a good enough result.
And there are, of course, concerns, David, about the future of the alliance and the prospects of another Trump presidency. What do you think might happen if Donald Trump becomes president again of NATO's largest member?
Yeah, I don't think it will actually be that much of a difference. I mean, the trope about Trump is that his detractors take him literally but not seriously, and his followers take him seriously but not literally. And I think that a lot of his threats are basically business tactics. And when you look at what he actually said about, withdrawing from NATO, I don't think he was describing, you up your defense budgets or the United States is leave. I think he was sometimes making a historic sort of analogy, saying in the long run, if Europe continues to underfund its own defense, you cannot expect the United States to make up that difference out of our own pocket. So I think it's more sound and fury signifying nothing.
David, very good to hear from you as always. Thank you very much for joining us on Al Jazeera. David Des Roches.
Thank you, Folly.